Yeah, hello everybody. Welcome to my lecture on polymer science and processing. My name is Nicolas Vogel. I'm from the Friedrich-Alexander-Universität in Erlangen-Nürnberg in Germany. And what I want to do in this lecture is introduce you a little bit to polymers, what they are, how they behave, and so on. So the content of this course will be, first, we want to learn what polymers are. This is pretty much what we will cover in this first introductory lecture. And then why they are interesting. And I hope that this will emerge more and more in the course of this lecture series. Then we want to look into how we can make polymers, so synthetic aspects of polymer science, how they behave and what kind of special properties they have, so more material science aspects. And then finally, how we can process them into something useful. So you see, we have quite a lot on our plate, and this broad variety of topics also necessitates that this lecture will be an introductory style lecture. So that means what I want to do is really provide you with a concise overview of all these different aspects of polymer science, and by doing so I will necessarily need to skip certain more specialized aspects to more specialized lectures. Now you could easily have a full lecture on polymer synthesis, a full lecture on polymer properties, polymer thermodynamics and so on. So what I'm doing is I'm shrinking all these topics together to give you a full picture, full introductory overview. So in a nutshell, what we want to do is the following. We have a lot of polymeric products, so wherever you're sitting now, at home or wherever, if you look around, you will see enormous amounts of polymers in your flat, on your desk and so on. Just pick two random examples. This stunt man or stunt woman over here is being shot out of a cannon, and obviously what she needs is a very strong helmet. So this helmet must be strong, shock absorbing, and should be very hard. On the other hand, this little princess over here, it's called the princess on the pea. She cannot sleep because there's a pea somewhere in her bed, and however many mattresses she puts on top of it, she simply starts to feel that. So a very sensitive person, and you can see that the polymeric properties of these mattresses here that she uses to cushion the effect of the pea are very different compared to that of the helmet. Now you will be surprised to hear that both of these materials, both the helmet and the mattresses, are both made from polyurethanes, which is a huge class of polymers. So somehow in the same class of polymers we can encode properties that are vastly different, as you can see in these two different examples. And the goal, or my wish for this lecture, would be that at the end of the lecture you can very clearly understand how these properties come about and how we can tailor these properties from molecular perspectives, if you want. So what do we need to do to a polymer to achieve either a helmet or a mattress? So in order to do this, in a sense, we need to start by having a look at the product. So how can we make these products, which is polymer processing. But before we can really process polymers, we need to know their properties. So what are their material properties? So this is in the realm of polymer materials or material science. But then again, before we really can dive into materials, we need to first understand how molecular structure determines the properties. So why is the helmet hard and why is the mattress soft? So this is more in the realm of polymer physics, so we need to understand how single polymer chains behave. And if you want, even before we do this, we want to know how we can actually make these polymers, which is polymer chemistry. So quite naturally, this gives us the outline of our lecture series. We will start with the polymer chemistry, so we can learn how to make polymers. We will then look at how these polymers behave, what is special about polymers. This will then naturally lead us to the material properties, and when we have this, we can put it all together and then use our knowledge to design processes that are efficient in creating polymeric materials. Good. So here again, in a short overview, this is how we go through polymer synthesis, characterization of polymers, properties of polymers in solution, so this dives into polymer thermodynamics, and then in bulk, real material properties, finally application processing and so on. Before we actually do this, let me just recommend some literature. I'm basing my lecture on this book here, Young and Lovell, Introduction to Polymers. So if you get this, it will be very easy for you to follow the lecture. For those of you that can speak German, there's a very easy book to read from Bernd Thieke, Macromolecular Chemie, that you can use that gives you a nice introduction. And for those of you that are actually here at the university and studying, on StudOn, I will upload all the lectures so you can directly access them, use them to take notes and so on. There's another source that I find extremely useful, which is the macromolecular. So click on this link here or check it. It's an extremely beautiful website that shows you very fundamental aspects of polymers, very applied aspects. Everything looks a little bit like very easy to access, almost a kindergarten style thing, but the science in there is very sound and it actually gives you very deep properties in a very simple fashion. So have a look at this to learn more about all kinds of different polymers. And of course, I think it goes without saying, but let me still capitalize on this. To prepare for the exam, it's always good to read a book. Now, this is kind of clear, and this is what I do as well to prepare for this lecture, but you shouldn't just follow my slides. If you want to really go deeper into the matter, look at this in a book so you get like the full kind of description of the chapters. And you will see that the chapters reflect my slides. Okay, what else? Other official stuff. As I said, the lecture slides will be available on StudOn. I will always try to do this before uploading the lecture so that you actually have the material at hand while you're watching this. I also invite everybody to ask questions via StudOn. So what I put there is a function called a forum. So you can pretty much have a chat forum. You can ask me questions. I can see them. I can either directly answer, or in our weekly lecture time, I invite you to join me in a Zoom meeting where we can have a discussion. This will be, as you see here, Mondays 2:15 p.m. Pretty much open-end, depending on how many questions you have. We can do it shorter or longer, but what we want to discuss is, or I will answer all the questions that you post to me by StudOn. So if you do this beforehand, I can of course prepare well. You can of course also ask me directly. We have digital quiz sessions that are meant for you to self-assess your understanding of the different topics that we discussed. And of course, I will also try to give you some additional information, fun facts, we'll draw some things, we'll maybe go a bit into modern research, what people do with these topics, and so on. So it's really meant as kind of an informative meeting for you to learn a bit more and to get, of course, a chance to discuss and have this in-person feeling. In order to make this efficient, please watch the chapter before the meeting, because it just makes more sense to discuss something that you have seen before. What else? Probably the most important for most of you that are here inscribed at the university. The exam will be an oral exam, will take 30 minutes after the semester, quite obviously, and I will schedule these exam dates with you once we get to this. So we get a choice and we find a convenient place and time and date for you to do this. So what I'm writing here will be distributed most likely digitally via StudOn as well. There's also an exercise session that accompanies this lecture. This will be given by my PhD student Salva. This will be on Wednesdays, 2:15 p.m. And also there, the focus will be on discussion. So you can also ask questions there if you don't want to ask me, or if you don't dare, or if you forgot about it. You can also ask Salva. Salva will also repeat relevant understanding of the lectures. He will discuss a little bit everyday life examples, so sometimes to underline a certain example or so, he will go into a bit more detail. And most importantly, you will get questions or problem sets that you can solve, and then Salva will discuss these solutions to the problems in the lecture. Okay, before we start with the lecture, let me briefly introduce myself. As I said, my name is Nicolas Vogel. I'm originally from Mainz in Germany, so you see Johannes Gutenberg here, the famous son of the city, and this is also where I studied. And I spent some time in South Korea at Seoul National University during my diploma program to study there a bit. Then I went for my PhD to the Max Planck Institute for Polymer Research, and I spent a couple of time in Greece, in Crete, and finally did a postdoc in Boston. There you see me in the deep US-American winter, before coming here as a professor to the university in Erlangen-Nürnberg. So what do I do here in my research? It's actually fairly simple. I play Lego. So what I and my group are interested in is creating defined building blocks and then try to understand and especially control how they assemble. And if we can do this, then quite naturally we can make complex materials. So this is kind of the aim. And my favorite Lego bricks are colloidal particles, which are very small particles. So you see one of these colloidal particles presented on a tip here. in this picture. And just to give you an impression, they are around about between maybe 100 nanometers and a micrometer or so. To give you an impression how small they are, so the difference in diameter between this colloidal particle that we typically work with and a soccer ball is pretty much the same as the difference in diameter between a soccer ball and planet Earth. So you see, indeed, we are dealing with spheres, but extremely small spheres. Nevertheless, spheres are spheres, and we can try to make something useful with this. And what we know is that spheres, if they are monodisperse in size, can pack very beautifully to form ordered structures. And that's something that we exploit. So here is a single, let's say, polymer particle. Typically polystyrene is something that we use, and by itself it cannot do anything. It's just a very, very tiny piece of plastic. But then we can assemble these into ordered layers, in this case in 2 dimensions, what we call a colloidal monolayer. And if we do this, we already get functional materials simply by exploiting the structure of this material. So we can either use this to further shape our substrate and then create functional nanostructures that can have very interesting optical properties, or we can make rough surfaces to tailor the wetting properties and especially make repellent materials that you see here of the ketchup that flies down. Well, then we can also go into 3 dimensions. We pack more and more spheres into a 3-dimensional crystal, and automatically we get nanoporous materials. And then we can also go away from a surface and look at confined space, which is scientifically very interesting. So how do these spheres pack in a spherical confinement? And then we can get access to superparticles that can also have interesting properties. Here you see this is, for example, a structural color pigment that has color that simply comes from the periodic arrangement of the particles within this superparticle. So how do we do this? Here's just a very quick example, and this is a video I took from YouTube, and let me play this for you. And you see that these particles, these people actually stole my idea on how one can make monolayers. You see they use an inclined plane, that all these shade balls roll down, and when it touches the 3-phase contact line, what you also see here, they start to assemble in a monolayer. And you also see that they do not do a particularly good job because they drop it much too fast, so it creates a lot of multilayers and so on. But very generally, this is exactly how we do our small colloidal nanoparticle layers as well. So you see this video runs for a long time. You see after some time, this is the typical close packing of spheres in 2 dimensions. And what we do here is the same thing. We exploit the air-water interface as a template to assemble the colloidal particles. How do we do this? You see we have a slide as well, or an inclined plane. In our case, we use a glass slide. This is a normal beaker. Then we let our colloidal dispersion drop down here. They slide down this ramp, get in contact with the water, assemble into these close packed layers, and then we simply take a substrate, fish them out, leave them for drying, and we are done. This is how the process looks like. Here you already see this layer of colloidal particles at the interface. Here you see a substrate that is being immersed and then coming out, and here's the substrate that is left for drying. And as you see a color here, can already tell you that these particles must be ordered because this color comes from grating diffractions, and this only occurs for ordered materials. And indeed, if you now look at an electron microscope, so a very powerful microscope that is able to resolve these small particles, you see that by really not exploiting any sophisticated technology, or you can do this in your own kitchen if you want, we create a very ordered arrangement. Clearly it's not perfect. No, you see here is a point defect. You have kind of dislocations, drying artifacts and so on. But generally, given the simplicity, this is a very beautifully ordered structure. And now mind the length scale. This scale is 1 micrometer. So one of these particles is approximately 250 nanometers. Just for comparison, the size of a human hair is approximately 50 micrometers. So these things are orders of magnitude smaller than a human hair. So you cannot see them, it's very, very small. Okay, so here's another example for a nanoporous material. In this case, it's in 3 dimensions. And again, you see this order that simply emerges by self-organization. So we don't really need to do anything to create these structures. And here you see these superparticles. Now this is what happens if you put these small particles in an emulsion droplet and let them assemble. Then they come out in these very interesting ordered structures. Okay, why should we bother? This is a picture of a bug, very similar to one that I found on my way to work a few years ago. So it has these typical iridescent colors. that are known to be produced from ordered layers within the skeleton, this exoskeleton of the beetle. And now if I show you examples of our layers that we do, we see we can create very similar colors. We can even change the color simply by changing the size of the colloidal particles. And there you see that really the structural color emerges from the ordered structure of the material and not from the material by itself. Polystyrene, which you know from styrofoam, definitely is not colorful. No, it's just a white material. Well, and if it comes to the repellent surfaces, let me briefly play this video. You see here is one of the substrate that we coated with a very intricate nanostructure. And you see if I drop red wine on it, it simply repels from the surface and does not stain the surface. You can also use olive oil, something that is a bit more sticky because it has a lower surface tension, and also the olive oil directly de-wets and doesn't get in contact with the surface. And finally, I think all of you know how sticky ketchup is, and also the ketchup doesn't really stick to the surface. Okay, so much to my person, but this course is of course not about me, but about polymers, and this is now where we directly want to dig in to see what we can learn about them. So this very first lecture is meant as a very simple introduction, and I just want to walk you a little bit through what polymers generally are, about the history of polymers. Then we want to take a close look at how we can maybe classify polymers, or what types of polymers exist. We go through some examples, and then finally I want to show you some very important property of polymeric materials, which is the distribution of molecular weight. Okay, let's start with an introduction to polymers. So the big question is, what are polymers and what makes them special? So it's actually very simple. Polymers have a high molecular weight, and they are typically, not always, organic molecules that form long chains. So that's also reflected in the name. Polymer means many parts. No, poly is a Greek word, polymeros, so many parts, and that means it's composed of a repeat unit that is kind of chained together or bond together for a long time to produce a long macromolecule. So if this is a very cartoonistic representation of a monomer, then this would be a polymer. And here's a typical example, maybe the simplest polymer. Ethylene here is converted into polyethylene, PE, something that all of you certainly know from plastic packaging, from maybe the cover of your cell phone and so on. And you see that the typical number of repeat units can be quite significant. So I would say something between maybe 1,000 and 100,000. Of course, depends on the polymer, can be a little bit less, can also be much more, but you see it will be really a very extended chain. So what does this mean for the properties? And there I will give you a very simple analogy that actually works fairly well for a lot of different or as a thought concept. If you think of monomers, these things here, as rice. So think about a bowl of rice, and now if you're hungry, you can start to pick out individual rice grains and eat them. And if a monomer is rice, then think about it for yourself. What kind of food would be a polymer? Right, spaghetti. So polymer in this case would be represented by a spaghetti, which has kind of similar cross-sectional dimensions as the rice grain, but is much longer. And now, of course, if you want to try to eat a single spaghetti and you pull on it, most likely you have the entire bowl of spaghetti in your hand. And this is a property that is known as entanglement. There's also, if you go climbing and you try to fix your climbing rope, you see this entanglement fairly often, that you have knots and entanglements in your rope. That's a typical property that occurs not only for spaghetti, but also for polymers. And this entanglement changes the mechanical properties and also the molecular properties of polymers quite significantly. So what are the consequences? We have entanglement, and that means that the chain mobility is strongly reduced. Not each polymer can move by itself because they're all kind of entangled, so it's much more difficult for them to move, hence the reduced mobility. Polymers also have a property that is known as class transition temperature. So they exhibit one more phase transition compared to small molecules. So in this case, the mobility of the chains depends on the temperature. If it's cold, then the chains cannot move at all, and the material will appear brittle and hard. And if the temperature increases, the polymer chains will be able to move, to adapt to different conformations when you stretch them or when you hit them, and the material will become much softer and can form, for example, an elastomer, so a rubber. This is a phase transition that you don't observe for typical water or small molecules. Then polymers also have viscoelastic properties. So in a sense, polymers combine properties of liquids, which are viscous, and solids, which are elastic. No, solids store energy, you squeeze, if you wait, it goes back. Liquids dissipate energy, so if you pour it out, it will just flow away, but it will not be restored. And polymers are somewhat in between. If you stress them for short times, they have elastic properties. If you continuously squeeze them, they will slowly and steadily start to flow. And they can also have semi-crystalline properties. So that means they contain parts that are non-crystalline, so amorphous, and crystalline, or can at least contain. Not all polymers do this. So you see polymers very often have combinations of different properties, or combination of properties typically arising from different materials, and they combine them in one class of materials. And this is really what makes them very interesting to study and what gives rise to interesting properties of polymers. So just as a quick example, mechanical properties of polymers, for example, depending on how we tune them, how we choose our polymers, our monomers, our interactions between the polymer chains, can be either super hard, now think about a bulletproof vest, or can be very soft if you think about a rubber. And again, think about the stunt woman and the princess on the P, where the mattress is very soft and the helmet is very hard. So extremely diverse mechanical properties, and this is part of what makes polymers very appealing to be tailored to different applications. But there's of course much more properties. Polymers are very cheap and easy to manufacture. Most of them come from very relatively simple petrochemicals. Hopefully more and more will come from renewable sources, and compared to, let's say, metals or glasses, you of course need to apply much lower temperatures to mold them, to fabricate them, to process them, and so on. They are also much lighter compared to typical inorganic materials. So if you compare a glass beer bottle, which will weigh around about 300 grams or so, this is just my estimation, a plastic beer bottle will be much lighter. And that means you need less fuel if you travel around from the brewery to your house. And it's also more mechanically stable in the sense that when you drop a plastic bottle, nothing happens. If you drop a glass bottle, it typically breaks. So there's really an advantage of using polymers as a packaging material, also in terms of, if you want, sustainability and energy efficiency. It's also, I already said this, there's loads of processes that we can use. This is something that we will look into at the end of our lecture series. So you can mold them, you can cure them to make them harder, you can 3D print them. There's all kinds of things you can do to shape a material in the way you want. The big disadvantage about polymers is that, in a sense, they are too successful. So they are too easy to make, they are too cheap to make, they are too easy to process, they are not expensive enough, and that leads to a lot of polymers just being thrown away. And if you take a look at a random beach, then this is something that you can find. So there's a lot of plastic in the oceans, in the environment very generally, and it does not only look disgusting, it's of course a big threat to all kinds of aquatic animals, possibly to humans as well, because they come into the food chain and so on. And this is really simply something that doesn't give justice to the beautiful world of polymers, that they are being so, if you want, abused and so carelessly handled as we do this today. So what we really need to work on, and I think this is probably the biggest challenge for polymer scientists, to try to come up with ways on how to prevent humans from wasting their environment and destroying their environment more and more. And certainly polymers are more part of the problem at the moment compared to part of the solution, even though there's high potential for them. Where there's hope, you can make polymers biodegradable. This is an example of polylactide, for example. So you can think about concepts on how we can exploit the attractive properties, the cheapness of manufacturing, the simplicity of manufacturing, also the lightweight, which helps to make things more fuel efficient, with properties that removes them from the environment, or maybe with more advanced recycling concepts and so on, to make sure that we don't have so much waste. Okay, what do we need polymers for? Now take a minute and think for yourself where you last had a polymer in your hand, or a polymeric material in your hand, and maybe in thoughts go through your daily life and think about where you get in contact with polymers. So of course, there's huge varieties of aspects where we use polymers, and this is certainly only a random selection that I will give you here. Some will be very obvious, some may be less so. So very obviously, packaging materials are typically polymers. So this can be bags, can be bottles, can be buckets, whatever, you name it. Organic electronics can be made from polymers. So here you see a flexible solar cell, and this of course can be either a gadget to charge your cell phone when you go hiking, which may not be needed, but this can also be a very good relief method for real serious disasters. Say there's a big earthquake or a problem or flooding, and this can really help people to get electricity, to boil drinking water, to maybe call their relatives to tell them they are safe, and to really do things that they need for survival. So this can really be an option for disaster relief measures. Well, for those of you that have kids, you will be very familiar and I guess very thankful for one particular type of polymers, and those are super absorbers that are typically in diapers and that can make your life significantly easier. And this is something that we will look into in more details in one of the upcoming lectures. All kinds of protection is often provided by polymers, and this can range from insulation in cables to insulation from bullets and bulletproof materials. Also, this is something that we will discuss in the next lecture. Clothing and outdoor equipment and sport equipment are very often high-performance polymers. Just an example, insulating jackets, water-repellent clothes, raincoats, and so on are all polymeric materials that are made for special purposes. In this case, for example, for you not to freeze, for you to not get wet, and so on. One more thing that is maybe less common is photolithography. So what you see here is a computer chip. And this computer chip fuels or powers your computer, powers my computer, powers your cell phones, and so on. And these are, of course, made by very sophisticated technologies. But one of the key steps is to use photodegradable polymers as thin films to be able to structure a substrate in a way that you can make transistors. Of course, that doesn't necessarily directly make a computer, but in the long run, this is the basic ingredient of a computer is a transistor, and this is conventionally done using polymer chemistry to structure a surface. So even in the most high-tech applications you can think of, one of the very basic processing steps involves polymers. Good. So with now having clarified what you use polymers for right now in your everyday life, let's have a look at where polymers came from, how they were discovered, and so on. So I would say polymers were around in the world at least for 1 million years. And I would also go so far as to say that there is no life possible without polymers. Why is that? Well, take a moment. 1 million years ago, definitely smartphones were not an issue. Neither were plastic bottles in the sea. But there's very, very important classes of polymers that have been around and that have shaped and, if you want, defined life in the way that we know it. Well, and this is very clear. The first fundamental ingredient in life is the DNA. The DNA is a polymer that is made out of nucleobases, and it has a very efficient way of pairing up by hydrogen bonding. This gives this characteristic double helix and makes it very stable. And this is exactly what you want to store genetic information, that it doesn't mutate too easily. So information storage and then transfer, of course, when you pass your genes to the next generation, it's kind of how life works in general, you need the DNA. Well, the second very important class of polymers are proteins. Proteins are polyamino acids, so formed from a set of amino acids that you have in nature. And proteins are the reason why I can stand here, why I can talk, why I can digest my food, why regulate my metabolism, and so on. So those are the functional machines in our body. And they're responsible for the synthesis of material, for the regulation, for transport properties, for making gradients in cells, getting activation potentials, and so on. And at the end of the day, this leads to your muscle to be able to move. Now, this is why I can do this here. Well, and the third very important class of polymers are carbohydrates. So polysaccharides, sugars that are made into longer chains. This is what we typically eat. I mean, okay, we also eat proteins, but this is our one of our main fuels. Now think about bread, think about pasta again, and so on. Okay, so you see that these very important classes of polymers have been around for a really long time. But in this lecture, this is really not something I want to focus too extensively on. Simply you can hold a complete lecture on biophysics of polymers, biological properties of polymers, and this will be far exceeding the aim of this introductory lecture. But keep it in mind, now biopolymers are very, very significant for life. Well, then, a long, long time, nothing happened until in the 19th century, Charles Goodyear discovered a process that is called vulcanization. And what he did is, so these polymers here are natural rubber. This is when you cut a rubber tree, this is what saps out. And he discovered if you boil this with sulfur, then you can cross-link these rubber materials. So you see they have double bonds here. This is again something we will go into detail a bit later. These double bonds can be connected by sulfur bridges, and this then connects the individual molecules. And as a consequence of this, you have one big molecule that cannot melt anymore. So you make a rubbery material that is stable. And if it's stable and doesn't really flow away, you can make it into something useful, such as car tires. And this is what to this time Goodyear stands for, not to make elastomeric materials as in rubber tires. And this really was a Kickstarter for the automotive industry and for all kinds of transportation. Well, then it took some more time until Leo Baekeland discovered a polymer that is known as bakelite. And what he did is he took two substances that are, let's say, semi-good for your health, phenol and formaldehyde. And he discovered that if you add a little bit of acid, then these things will start to polymerize and form very extensive networks. And he saw that this material in the beginning was still soft and moldable, and eventually if you heat it up, it more and more starts to cross-link, so hardens. And after a while, it becomes a very sturdy material that you cannot melt, that you cannot dissolve, and that is very stable against all kinds of different environments. And then if you add some more fillers, wood chips, stones, powder, whatever, then you can have very improved mechanical properties. And this was really one of the first polymers that became available commercially in a big range of applications. So if you go to your grandmother's house, for example, and look at very old telephones, remember the really heavy black ones that sit on the wall, or if you look at all kinds of plastic switches or frames or relays, these are typically formed from bakelite. Similarly, if you go to a random hipster cafe in the next city and you see these kind of old-fashioned looking ashtrays, they're very often made from bakelite as well. They have a typical brownish black color and this kind of marmot texture. Okay, so this is really the first commercial hit in polymer science. And then came Hermann Staudinger. And he, in a sense, really was the brain father of macromolecules. So he was the one that discovered what is going on in these weird reactions. And what he had was a scientific problem. So these substances that people started to do, like this bakelite, they couldn't be distilled. They were very viscous in melt and in solution, which we nowadays really take for granted that this is a typical property of a polymer. But if you didn't really know what was in your reaction vessel, this is a real puzzle. And then he did end group titrations. This was kind of their way back in the day to figure out what kind of a material it is. Now, does it have acid end groups, does it have basic end groups, and so on. And he apparently didn't detect any end groups, which is clear because the polymer is really long and there's very little ends compared to chains, if you want. And also he discovered that it doesn't really crystallize, which is also a typical property for small molecules and used in these days to characterize the material. So, long story short, he had something in his reaction vessels that he couldn't characterize thoroughly. And then he put in some thinking and then came up with this. Now this is a paper in German, and what he says is, will man sich eine Vorstellung über die Bildung und Konstitution solcher hochmolekularen Stoffe machen, So if you want to understand how these high molecular weight materials come or arise, so kann man annehmen, dass primär eine Vereinigung von ungesättigten Molekülen eingetreten ist. So one can hypothesize that there has been kind of unsaturated molecules have been joined together, ähnlich einer Bildung von 4 und 6 Ringen, so similarly to make rings composed of 4 or 6 members, but dass aber aus irgendeinem eventuell sterischen Grunde der Ringschluss nicht stattfand und nun zahlreiche, eventuell hunderte von Molekülen sich zusammenlagern. So but that for some reason, possibly steric, this formation of a ring did not occur, and that now a lot, possibly hundreds of molecules join together to form a long macromolecule. And that, in a nutshell, is really what a macromolecule is. So without really having all the tools that we have at hand, he really discovered or conceptualized what is going on. And as a side note, if nowadays you write a paper that says that possibly for some reason, maybe a steric reason, something does not happen, but possibly something else happens, then I'm very sure that you get a letter back saying that you need to do your homework a bit better. At these days, this was sufficient to earn a Nobel Prize. Okay, but of course the big achievement was that he really determined the concept of macromolecules, and once he could do this, then he could also determine molecular weights and so on to really put numbers to his hypothesis. So really, really grand achievement. Then came Wallace Carothers. So you saw this was 1924, so in the golden 20s, 1928, a little bit later, Wallace Carothers was the first person to rationally synthesize polymers. So he picked up on this idea by Hermann Staudinger that if you have materials that have very long chains, then there must be a way on how to rationalize or rationally synthesize them. And he was a good chemist, and he knew that if you have a reaction that works well, and if you make this reaction again and again and again, then you create longer and longer molecules. So his idea was, if he knows that you can build an ester from an alcohol and an acid, then you have this ester bond. And if you do a diacid and a dialcohol, then you can make on both sides the material longer and longer and longer, and then you come up with polymers. This is something that we nowadays know as a step growth polymerization, and is one of at least the two very fundamental ways on how we can make polymers. This will be the subject of next week's lecture, and he was really the person that understood this. Well then, not shortly afterwards, times got more and more dire. Eventually the Second World War started, and matter of factly, this World War really boosted the polymer production. And why? Well, first of all, that eventually when the Allies started to try to conquer Nazi Germany, it was not very easy to get into the continent because it was so heavily fortified, and a lot of parachutes were needed so that they can really jump in behind the enemy lines. And parachutes are made from nylon, so they need to be very lightweight. No, you cannot really jump out of a plane if you have a metal gear on. And polymers really had the perfect solution because they were very sturdy. By the way, exactly these polymers that Wallace Carothers started to synthesize and were then used to create a lot of parachutes. And meanwhile, Nazi Germany had a very different problem. They needed cars, to drive around and be nasty to everybody in the world. And to make cars, you need rubber, otherwise you don't have tires. But now, in the course of the war, eventually the Allies managed to block all the sea access of Germany. So there was no way for Germany to get rubber from South America, from Africa, and so on. And this problem was, the Nazis tried to overcompensate for this problem by inventing a synthetic way on how to make rubber. And eventually they came up with the so-called Buna process that gave rise to synthetic rubbers. This is something that we will discuss a little bit later, based on copolymers, and hence they were able to make tires. So one problem with this process is that the elastic properties of the tires are not quite as good as the ones of mechanical rubber, and especially if it becomes very cold, then the synthetic rubber that the Nazis came up with is not as forgiving to cold temperatures compared to natural rubber. And that means if you're trying to conquer Russia and it becomes winter, then you better have tires that perform even in the coldest temperatures. Well, I'm not saying that this caused a change in the war, but this definitely was a problem that the tires didn't work so well and became brittle in the coldest times of the year. Well, good for the world, I'd say, not so good for polymer science, but this nowadays is used, of course, for much different concepts, so it's good to have a synthetic way to make rubber. But to this day, for example, airplane tires are made from natural rubber to prevent this formation of brittle materials when it becomes very cold up in the air. Okay, so luckily, eventually the war was over, and then the world could relax and lick their wounds and recover from this huge disaster, and also polymer science could go back, or scientists could go back to doing what they like best, and that is understanding. And in the 50s, understanding of macromolecules, both in chemistry, biology, and physics, became much more and more established, and you can see this by the a range of Nobel Prizes that were awarded to polymer scientists. So 53, no, this is almost only 8 years after the end of the Second World War, these two gentlemen, Watson and Crick, discovered the DNA as the double helix, and this gave them a Nobel Prize approximately 10 years later. 1 year later, Ziegler and Nutter, these two persons, got a Nobel Prize for the catalytic synthesis of polyethylene. So this was really a big step in making very polymer materials with very good mechanical properties on a huge scale. And to this day, the Ziegler-Nutter process is still used to make high-density polyethylene. And again, if you look through your room, you certainly find something. Just check on the backside of the plastic materials that is made from high-density polyethylene, or HDPE. And then 1953 as well, Paul Flory, a physicist, US physicist, started to work on polymer thermodynamics, and he tried to really rationalize or conceptualize why polymers behave differently compared to small molecules in a thermodynamic way. So for example, why they dissolve less, why they mix less, and why their properties change, especially with molecular weight. And this awarded him the Nobel Prize, 1974. And don't forget the name Flory. This is something that we will also have to exercise, the so-called Flory-Huggins model, to understand the solubility and miscibility of polymers. But this we will do later. Well then, from the 70s on or so to now, of course, there was increasing progress in the synthesis and properties of polymers. And just want to give you some brief highlights. Bruce Merrifield, 1984, got the Nobel Prize for a synthetic way on how to make peptides. So nowadays, mankind is pretty much able to do synthetic peptides or DNA sequences and so on. And this all comes from this idea on how to do solid phase peptide synthesis from Bruce Merrifield. 1991, Pierre Desgennes, a Frenchman, got a Nobel Prize for the understanding of order and dynamics of polymers. So he discovered or developed the field that is now known as soft matter. So how materials behave that are not covalently bound, but are kind of more dynamically bound or more physically bound. And polymers are a very typical example of this. In 2000, Heger, McDermott, and Shirakawa got the Nobel Prize for the discovery of conductive polymers. So to this point, and even to the point of nowadays, people associate polymers with insulators. Now this is why you wrap polymers around your copper cable. And these guys discovered that under the right conditions, you can make polymers conductive, thus opening, of course, much different fields for their applications. And in 2005, a few years later, Chauvin, Krebs, and Schock got a Nobel Prize for the metathesis polymerization, so a different catalytic process on how one can make polymers. So just judging from the amount of Nobel Prizes and the amount of knowledge, you see that this really has been a very important field in science, and it has been a very successful field. Now, this is why we use polymers so often and so widespread. And this is just reflected by the huge amount of science that really got into this field. So with all this done, what do people do nowadays? Let me just pick more or less randomly 3 topics that I find fairly interesting. One is you can do supramolecular chemistry and self-healing materials. So what people nowadays start to discover and start to work on is making polymers that are not covalently linked, but dynamically can form and unform bonds. This is known as supramolecular chemistry. And such a material has very interesting properties. Now, a typical material, here the control, if you cut them in 2 parts, then of course that's it. No, you break the bonds and then they cannot reform anymore. So what is broken is broken. In this self-healing material, so these 2 things, you cut them And if you hold them together, then new bonds spontaneously form, and then you recover a self-healed material. So this is just a beautiful concept extending our conventional understanding and knowledge and, if you want, perception of how bonds are being formed. Well, then people look at phase separation and tailor nanoscale morphologies. So I already kind of hinted at that polymers do not mix so well. And if you exploit this, then you can make small particles that have different properties. So here you see one particle, this is a sphere, that is composed to one half of one polymer, polylactic acid, and on the other half of a different polymer, polystyrene. And now in the very beginning, I told you that I like to play with Legos, and now look at the beauty of these building blocks. Now it's much more sophisticated, has much different properties. You can exploit anchoring on one side, anchoring on the other side. You can form chains, you can form different materials. So this is a beautiful playground for anybody that likes to do self-assembly. And another big promise of polymer materials is drug delivery, or the whole section of biomaterials. So just imagine now you catch a cancer, and the classical way of treating this is that you swallow very toxic medicine that will pretty much destroy all your cells, with the rationale that the cells, the cancerous cells, will be destroyed or attacked a little bit easier because they tend to be more porous and less well defined. And a much more beautiful way, of course, would be you have a polymer material, you load it with a certain payload of drug. Now it's shielded from the exterior, you let it circulate in your body until it finds the cancer cell, enters the cancer cell, and upon a stimulus releases all the payload. And then you can exploit maybe temperature by locally heating it up, different pHs, different proteins, different enzymes, and so on. So there's a lot of different ways on how one can do this concept, but it's of course very promising in the field of drug delivery and treatment of diseases. Okay, so you see, still plenty of work to do for polymer scientists. Good, let me move to the next chapter, the next small chapter, and this would be a classification of polymers. So it's a rational question to ask how we can define polymers, or how we can categorize polymers or classify polymers in different categories. Now maybe take a moment and think about all the polymers that you know, that you have come across in your life. How would you kind of sort them? And in order to do this, we can just do this together on the blackboard. Types, or let's say categories of polymers. Well, and as so often, of course, the right category is in the eye of the beholder, and it really depends on what kind of questions you ask. So one question to ask, or if you want to classify polymers, you can ask, how do they look like? So what is the difference in their molecular architecture, in their molecular appearance? So I already told you in the beginning that we can picture polymers as spaghettis. That's only partial truth. That's a very important and maybe predominant class of polymers, which would be linear chains. So the architecture can be linear or chain-like. But you can also have chains that have branches. So the chain will look like this. You can also connect different chains. So you have individual chains, and they are interconnected. Then we speak of a network. So the connections can also extend in other directions. So this would be a polymer network. And then you have maybe some more specialized networks. So kind of the extreme case of a branched polymer is known as a hyperbranched polymer. And this is, if you want, the Ponzi scheme of polymer science. So you have a monomer, and at each intersection, it splits up and doubles. and so on. And then you can exploit this hyper-branching concept that you kind of split up at each intersection to make it even more uniform. So instead of starting with one single bond, you can start with something that has different starting points, and then at each of the starting points, you do the same thing. So it grows, if you want, in a radial fashion away from this starting point. No, at each of these, and so on. And this architecture is known as a dendrimer, or a dendritic polymer. Dendrimers. This would be a type of classification based on how the polymer chains or the polymer material architecture looks like. But you can also think about, if you want, the order of monomers, which would also be parts of the molecular architecture. Let me just put it here. So if we zoom in a little bit more here and look how these individual chains look like, well, then clearly you can have what is known as a homopolymer. And this simply consists of one monomer. So let's just call this AAAA, one polymer chain. But now you can also mix two types of polymers. So a polymer A or a monomer A and a monomer B. And this is known as copolymers. And there's different ways on how we can mix them. So we can either not care at all and randomly add A's and B's. And so on. And then we would speak of a random copolymer. But we can also alternate A, B, A, B, and so on and so forth. And then we would speak of an alternating block copolymer. An alternating copolymer, sorry, alternating. Well, and then you can say, instead of alternating, you just put all the A's on one side and all the B's on the other side. So this would look like, let's put it here. So this we would call a block copolymer. Alternating copolymer. Well, and the final way is you can make one chain of A's. And now you craft chains of B on the sides. And this would be a craft copolymer. So you see, even if you have two monomers, there's a great variety of things how you can arrange them, and you can imagine that the resulting properties can be very different. Now this will be a much more stiff A chain, and then you can have flexible B chains, for example. Here you will have properties that are somewhat related to the types of homoblock copolymers. Here these properties will be completely mixed. They may crystallize much better and so on. So there's really a lot that you can tune and play around with. But then of course you could say, well, this is just the molecular architecture, but I'm more interested in the material properties. So you can also ask, what are the properties of the materials? And then you can and as typical material properties could be the thermal behavior, the mechanical behavior, and so on. And then you can classify, for example, between something soft and hard. So this would be an elastomer. Versus something harder, and something harder is often called a thermoplast. So a thermoplast would be something that can be remelted when you heat it up, so it's plastic at high temperatures, or it can be something that cross-links and forms a network and hardens and cannot be remolten. And this would be called a duroplast. The thermoset, this is probably the better word, so to contrast it to thermoplast. Or you can think about the crystallinity. So materials can be amorphous, or semi-crystalline. And we can see that polymer fibers are, if you want, an extreme case of semi-crystalline polymers where all the crystallites are oriented. So I can put this here maybe in brackets. And finally, now I'm running out of space here, doesn't really matter. We can ask about the we could also ask about the origin. So where do the polymers come from? So polymers can either be synthetic polymers, and then we can even distinguish on how we made them. So there's of course a range of different synthetic methods, and you can classify them, and this is something that we will discuss about, as either a step growth so this will be a polycondensation, a polyaddition, and so on, or you can have a chain growth. So the typical example for this would be a radical polymerization. It's how you, for example, make polystyrene. Well, it can also be inorganic polymers. Implying that these are organic polymers, so they could be made from sulfur, from silicon, from phosphorus. So this would also be a different way to classify them, and of course they will have different properties as well. Or they could originate from biology, so it could be biopolymers. And we already said biopolymers could be polysaccharides, so this would, for example, be cellulose, cotton fibers, and so on. So things that we wear. Wood is a type of polysaccharide. So there's a lot of these polysaccharides. It could be polypeptides. So amino acids, proteins, and so on. Or it could be polynucleotides, which is, for example, the DNA. And of course, there's much more classes. But especially polysaccharides are a very versatile class of materials. So some you can eat, some you can wear, some you can build your house with if you think about wood. Some are very hard, kainin, for example, so the material of the exoskeleton of animals, and so on. And all these can be somewhat classified as these polysaccharides. So you see, really, it depends on what you want to do with polymers or what you are interested in, and there's a very broad choice of materials and, of course, also of classifications. here you see these things. So how do we call polymers? That's actually very easy. Homopolymers, we find the name of the monomer, and this can be the tricky part, and we add a poly from this. So if you understand that this unit is a methyl methacrylate, then this would be polymethyl methacrylate. This unit comes from ethylene, hence it's called polyethylene. And now if you have copolymers, then you simply either specify or not how they are chained together. Just consider what we just had on the blackboard. So it could be poly A, co B, polystyrene, co polybutadiene, or so. Could be random, could be alternating, could be poly A, polystyrene, block, polybutadiene, and so on. So this is really how you can name them or how you can label these polymers. Okay, just some examples, very typical thermoplastic materials. I'm not sure, I'll just leave you to guess what these materials are. Very common polymers. So you see, first one is polyethylene, then we have polytetrafluoroethylene, PTFE. This guy here is polystyrene, or here we have polyvinyl chloride, or PVC. And now I guess most of you can guess what we make from these materials or where they are used. I'll take a minute to think about this. So PE, I guess the more accurate question would be, what can you not make of PE? So you do molded objects, insulation, bags, toys, wrapping, and so on. PTFE is very inert at high temperatures, and has a very low surface energy, so you use this to make rain jackets, you make coatings, chemically inert coatings, high temperature coatings, coatings that do not stick, so your pen is, you use PTFE in your pen to make sure that your fried egg doesn't stick. Polystyrene is one of these cheap throwaway plastics, unfortunately, so you make a lot of moldable objects, toys, insulation, or styrofoam is probably very well known as styrene, but you can also make high impact polystyrene. This can be bumpers for cars, so you can make it more shock absorbing. There's a lot of things you can do with polystyrene as well. And PVC is a classical thing that we may know from as vinyl, so vinyl recordings are from this, but you also make pipes or insulation materials or floor coatings because it's very scratch resistant. Okay, some more thermoplastic materials. These are a little bit more complex. Maybe let me just run you through it. This is also a very important class of polymers. This is, in this case, polyamide 6. So this is a class of polymers that is known as polyamides or nylons. Here we have PMMA, polymethyl methacrylate. And this guy here is a polymer that is composed of two parts. This first part and this part here. And this can either be a polyethylene terephthalate. This is terephthalic acid. This would be ethylene glycol, or polybutylene terephthalate, so PET or PBT. And now think about where you find these materials here. And I can already show you that the first one are textile fibers, so very typical polyesters and bottles. So if you happen to have a plastic bottle in front of your desk, most likely it's made from PET. PMMA you use to make transparent windows, so in the hockey stadium, for example, or in airplanes, and this is known as plexiglass. And nylon, polyamides, of course you make textiles, fibers, threadings, and so on, parachutes, stockings. So there's a lot of variable materials that is fairly durable that is made from nylon. So just some elastomers. So you see here different chemical structures. Let me just walk you through this a bit faster. This is natural rubber, polyisoprene. This is styrene butadiene rubber, SBR, or polystyrene block butadiene. This is polybutadiene. This is polystyrene. This is the synthetic rubber that I mentioned before. These things here are polyurethanes, and this one here is known as PDMS, polydimethylsiloxane. So this is an example of an inorganic polymer. You see that the backbone is composed of Si and O units. So in a sense, this is the similar composition as glass, but you don't form a three-dimensional network of SiO bonds, but you have an organic component. So what do we use these for? Well, PDMS is silicone, so you use this for all kinds of sealings, baking stuff in the kitchen, or it has a very low surface energy, so it's easy to remove things from it, molds, tubings, and so on. Polyurethanes, you make a lot of clothes from it, sport shoes, spandex, swimwear, insulation, helmets, mattresses, and so on. So this is a very large class of polymers. You have these synthetic rubber, which you can use for car tires, for sport shoe soles, for tennis balls, and so on. And as I said, natural rubber is to this day used to make airplane tires. Okay, this brings me to the last section for this part of the lecture, and this would be the definition of molecular weight. So why is it important to discuss this? So think about that properties of polymers are controlled to a very large extent by the length of their chain. Now, I gave you the analogy, if you compare rice to spaghetti, then of course all these problems arising from spaghetti, namely that you cannot pick them up individually, will become more and more severe the longer the spaghetti is. And likewise, of course, if you want to phrase it positively, mechanical properties will become better and better if the chain gets longer, because it's much more interconnected. So such a chain forms in the course of many reactions. And that means that very typically, not all chains have exactly the same chain length. No, it's always distributed. Some grow a little bit faster, some grow a little bit slower. So you get a chain molecular weight distribution. And in order to now characterize a polymeric material, it is very important not only to know if the chains are long and short, but to know how distributed they are. Are they very narrow? Are they all very long? Are they very broad? So is it a mixture of very long and very small ones? Because all this will very crucially affect the properties. And this is a problem you never have with small molecules. No, a water molecule is a water molecule is a water molecule. Never doesn't change. The molecular weight is 18 grams per mole. Done. With polymers, it's much more complicated. And this is why we need to spend some effort to understand this. But first, let me give you an example. Polymers based on acrylic acid. So what we see here is how long the polymer is, very schematically, and then I show you applications of this. So we can make very short acrylic acid polymers. Let's say 5,000 grams per mole, a few 10, 20 monomer units. This will be used as dispersant. So you add this to a solution, to a dispersion of particles, and they will become more stable. So you can disperse particles. Now you make the polyacrylic acid a little bit longer, and now you use it as a detergent, as a washing, things for washing processes to clean your clothes. Now you make it much longer, let's say 2 million grams per mole, and suddenly the very same polymer, the very same chemistry, instead of being a dispersant that you use to make particles more stable, it becomes a precipitant. So now you add this to particles and they all precipitate. So it really diametrically changes its properties from something that helps stabilizing to something that destroys stabilization, simply by the different chain length. And why is also clear. This has a lot of charges. Here you connect multiple particles, so they become bigger and bigger. Here you add them on the surface of the particles, so they get more charged and therefore more stable. Now if you take this material and you add some crosslinks, then you have a superabsorber. Now you use it in a diaper to soak up water. So you see very different fields of applications with exactly the same polymer, and the only difference is the molecular weight. And this is why it's so important to understand this and to know this. So how can we characterize this? There's different ways on how we can measure the molecular weight or determine the molecular weight. There's a number average molecular weight, which you determine by counting the molecules, the molar mass, and the number of molecules, and you divide it by the total number of molecules. And there's also the weight average, where you multiply the molecular weight of a single species by its mass, and you divide it by the total mass. And those are two different averages. Don't worry about it, I will give you an example to show you the difference in these. important to notice is, again, you see these different averages, that the weight average is always larger than the number average unless you have a perfect molecular weight distribution. If all species are the same length, these two will coincide. And if we know these different averages, we can calculate the degree of polymerization. So this is typically known as xn or xw for number average or weight average, and you divide the molecular weight that you get by the molecular weight of a monomer. It's kind of clear. Then you know how many molecules you have in a chain. Okay, so let me use the last few minutes to give you an example on, or to explain to you in a very simple examples what the difference between the weight and number average of the molecular weight is. But for this, I briefly need to make some space. Okay, so we look at molecular weight distributions and we take the very simple examples of having 3 polymer chains. One polymer chain has 5 units. A second polymer also has 5 units. And then we have one polymer that has 10 units. Okay, very generic representation of a polymer. So now we ask ourselves, what is the average weight of the polymer chains? What the average? Well, now do the math for yourself. If I would do the math, what I would say is, well, that's very easy. We have 1 times 5. We have 1 times 5. And we have 1 times 10. And we divide all of this by 3. And this would then be 20 divided by 3. Or round about 13. Now this would be the typical, 13. 6.9. So this is from the other example. So what do I do here to rationalize this? Well, I take the sum over all chains, Ni, and now I count. So this would be 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. I always count a certain fraction divided by the total number of chains that I have. And now I multiply it by the weight of the single chain. So in this case, 1 times 5, another 1 times 5, and 1 times 10. Or in other words, you can also make this a bit easier, and saying this would be and this is what we typically call the number average. Because what we count is the different numbers of polymer chains. So to me, this makes perfect sense, but I'm a chemist and I look at molecules and at numbers of molecules. But now you could ask, let's say, a material scientist. And he would say, well, that's very easy. We have a total weight of 20. 10 plus 5 plus 5 makes 20. And now we look which fraction of polymers has which weight. So you could say total weight. And then we have one fraction with a weight of 5. And this would be 10 over 20% of the weight. So 1/2 of the chains has a weight of 5. And then we have one fraction with 10. And this fraction also has half of the weight. So that means if we now make our average, we would say we have 1/2 times 10 plus 1/2 times 5. And this would be 5 plus 2.5. This would be 7.5. So obviously the math doesn't match up. Now here I calculated 6.9. Here I calculated 7.5. So which one is right? Am I right as the chemist that sums up the molecules, or as the molecular scientist here, or me as the material scientist, right, that sums up the mass of these fractions? Well, there's no right and wrong. It's just different ways and looking at the material and different averages that you do. So let's look what we do here in more mathematical terms. We take a sum of individual fractions with a certain weight, mi over mi. So this would be the 1/2 here and the other 1/2. And then we multiply it with the molecular weight of that certain fraction. So 1/2 of the sample has a molecular weight of 5, and the other half has a molecular weight of 10. And of course, we can also express this as it's kind of the same thing. Sum mi divided by mi. And this is what we call the mass average. So here you see in a very simple example, and this here is the number average. In this very simple example, you already see that there's a discrepancy, and this discrepancy just comes from the distribution of materials. So just to make a thought experiment, if you cut this chain here, then you only have one fraction and all have 5 members. So the weight average here would be 1 times 5 plus 1 times 5 plus 1 times 5 plus 1 times 5. So 4 times 5 divided by 4 is 20 over 4 is 5, which makes sense because there's only members with 5 building blocks in there. But here would be the same thing. It's only one fraction. So it's 1 over 1 that contains 5. So also it comes out as 5. So the lesson is that if the distribution of molecular weight is the same, then it doesn't make a difference. If there is a difference in molecular weight distribution, then you have different averages, and you can even use these different averages to compute or to get, if you want, a sense on how broad or how narrow your distribution is. And how you do this, you simply define something that is known as the polydispersity index, or short PDI. And this PDI, you simply calculate by dividing the weight average by the number average. And this gives you a measure on how polydisperse your sample is. One is monodisperse. Typical polymers have a distribution of 2. Especially in step growth, so this is called the Schulz-Flory distribution. And industrial polymers can be very polydispersed, so if you don't really care and you just want to make large quantities, then you can have very broad distributions. Okay, so here's the simple example on how to rationalize why there is different distributions, and one simply averages by number, the other one by weight, hence number average and weight average, and we just saw that indeed these averages coincide in the way that the weight average is higher than the number average. Okay, here's the example again. Here's the PDI, and to briefly sum up what we learned today, I discussed a little bit what is special about the polymers. Take this picture of spaghetti with you. This actually serves as a very good and simple analogy. We saw that polymers have been around from a long time, and only since very shortly mankind started to make them itself, and that directly led to a big disaster in pollution, but this is very typical if mankind takes over. We saw it's different ways on how we can classify polymers depending on what we are interested in. For us, very important will be these molecular arrangements. So what kind of chains do they have? Are they connected, so cross-linked or not? Are these block copolymers? Is it not? Is it homopolymers? And so on. So this really will define the properties to a very large extent. We saw a lot of applications for polymers. And finally, we discussed the molecular weight distribution as really a key parameter that we need to know to understand the properties of polymers. So with this, I'm at the end of the first lecture. I thank you very much for your attention and have a good day. See you in the next lecture. Thank you.